floor. Thank you to everybody. I would like to thank FIAP for this invitation, and the subject I'm going to talk about is sustainability. You've heard over different presentations, we've heard about ESG, and I think this is a good opportunity, above all, given what's going on in Europe, to share with you the concepts of ESG and what sustainable investment means. Why do I say this? Well, because there are many institutions and clients, institutional clients around the world, and above all in Latin America, that are starting to study ESG investment. And my idea is to share with you, well, not just the way we see it in our organization, but also the regulatory situation that we're seeing in Europe. So what does sustainability mean? In our opinion, to be able to talk about sustainability, we have to talk about 5 pillars. 5 pillars. Sustainability is not just about environmental, social governance criteria, but rather we have to talk, first of all, about integrating these factors, the ESG factors, into all investment processes. And we mustn't forget that ESG investment is a layer of risk management upon traditional risk management, and as such it should allow us to obtain or take better grounded decisions and to work with companies and governments that are doing things in a sustainable way. And secondly, which is also very important, we have to interact with companies and governments. And I say governments because almost everybody in conversations and working meetings I have, almost everybody talks about companies. No, it's not just about companies, but also it's about interacting with governments in order to promote better practices. Another point when we talk about sustainable investment is that you have to exercise your voting rights in shareholders' meetings and in meetings with governments. Another challenge that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is that of being transparent with investors. And although it seems simple, it's actually very complicated. We are seeing, well, we saw last week, we saw that the last regulations came out for sustainable investment, where we have 161 pages, and I read the bullet points and I almost fell asleep. But you know that in Europe, that's the way things are done. And lastly, Pablo mentioned that we have a fiduciary duty. We have to administer things, our funds, in a responsible way. And we have to be able to channel the investments in a responsible way to those companies and governments that really act in line with sustainable criteria. What do we understand by ESG? It's environment. I've given you an example here. It depends, obviously, but we're talking about over 120 factors that can be analyzed between environmental, social, and governance. And here we have an example. This would be an environmental example for companies. We have the subject of the emission of greenhouse gases, CO2, pollution, scarcity of water. And for governments, we're talking about management or scarcity of natural resources, this transition to a low-carbon economy, adaptation to climate change. And social, well, we have health, education, and working rights for the governments, and in companies, well, their employees, the impact on public health and local communities. At the level of governance, this is what's always been done. You have the governments which have to deal with a political system, human rights, and corruption, etc., etc. And coming back to the example of Mexico, we have a lot of investment in Mexico, and when our managers go to Mexico, they sit down with the government, they talk about corruption, and governance, human rights, and so on. Now, if we talk about ESG investment, what are the 6 kinds? This is to make it very clear, because everybody talks about ESG investment, but people don't make any distinctions. But there are 6 kinds of ESG investments when it comes to creating a portfolio. The first one, and the most basic one, is all about exclusions. You apply exclusions, you exclude companies, countries, certain sectors, and that's very basic. The second part is a filter based on rules, and we all are familiar with the subject of international UN regulations for best practices. Then we come to what are really the 3 or 4 ESG factors where you're going to find investment solutions. And as Pablo said, to be able to invest in a sustainable, responsible way, you need products or you need solutions, strategic ones, sustainable ones. So first of all, you have best in class. This means that what you're doing is to come up with a scoring system for ESG for each company, with financial analysis as well, and you only work with the ones which have the best ESG scores. So it's a sub-universe. I'm not saying it's the best or the worst, but it's one type. And then we have ESG integration. In other words, in all of the investment processes and the decision-taking include ESG factors. So you have the financial aspects on one hand and the ESG on the other hand, and you have the portfolio manager has all of that integrated, all of it together in order to take decisions. Then we have thematic investments, and this is a global equities investment where the subject of investment in itself is sustainable. And that's perhaps what we're seeing right now. It's simpler initially if we want to begin with ESG investment. And then we have impact investment, where the strategy is actually looking for a positive impact in a social or environmental sense, which also must be measurable. And here we would come back to the issue of transparency. With regards to exclusions, I'm not going to go into detail, but exclusions, we have to apply exclusions. Here we can see three different, we have several different colors. We have green, blue, and kind of reddy purple. So the exclusions can be defined by the financial group or by the stamps, because another huge challenge is standardization. There's no standardization. We can talk about labeling or stamps for sustainability. They don't exist in Europe. They are starting to standardize through the legislation, but it's very complicated. But we have different kinds of exclusions, those based on controversial activities, weapons, tobacco, alcohol, adult entertainment, and then we have exclusions which are very fashionable at the moment with regards to environmental issues. But here we're talking about minimum and maximum thresholds, for example. Just to give you an example here, if we look at we don't invest in companies that have over 25% of conventional production of oil and gas. So it's all about helping companies in a path towards being more sustainable, towards more sustainable activities. It's really important, this concept, because right now we're seeing a lot of discussion. Many investors, institutional investors, are saying, no, I exclude all fossil fuels. No, we don't exclude fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, in simple terms, the oil companies are going to pay the energy transition. We mustn't stop investing in the oil companies. They're the ones that have money to pay for the transition. Another thing quite different is, if we look at this example, is, well, if we are looking at an unsustainable company, very unsustainable company that we can see here, we wouldn't invest in that. This is an analysis of mining companies, one in Russia and one in Kazakhstan. And just by looking at the photo, we can see which one is more sustainable and which one is less sustainable. I stole this from Inverco, this slide, but somehow this slide reminds me that once when we were in Latin America on a roadshow about 10 years ago, and the objective was to explain what Europe was. So the way we explained it was, well, we said, look, the Constitution, well, the American Constitution has 100 words, is it? It says the importation of, well, beetroot rules for Europe has 1,400 pages, translated into several languages, and that's Europe. So we have lots of different taxonomies. For example, we've got the eco label, we've got the MIFID and UCITS, and I would focus more on the regulation. But here we can see this huge regulatory tsunami. You have to comply with all of these regulations at a European level. What's the advantage? Well, in comparison to Latin America, well, we're far ahead of Latin America. And so, well, in Latin America, they can just do a copy-paste. So that will save time. But if you want to know more about the legislation and the regulations, talk to Angel and not me. So when we talk about dissemination, what do we try to do? We try to simplify as far as possible. We talk about Article 6, Article 8, and Article 9. Whenever I talk, I try to eliminate numbers. We have instead light green, green, and dark green. The regulator won't let us, but anyway, Article 6 integrates ESG factors in investment strategies. That integration is done there. Another different matter is that this is not determining, or will not determine the decision. The manager takes the decision. Article 8 is green because the ESG factors there form an integral part of the investment decision, and they are the ones that determine or decide whether you invest or not in that company with a specific ESG classification. And then Article 9 would be dark green, and that's the impact, where you have the objective of a specific social and environmental impact, but what's more, it's measurable, and you have to provide reports on that impact. And of course, as I mentioned before, the interaction with companies, voting, proxy voting is applicable for all of these. I'm not going to go into much detail with regards to this information, but I have got a kind of snapshot for any investment family. If you go to any managing entity, you would have to see this photo or show this photo. Great. Do you do ESG investments? Yes. How? Well, here you can see with the axes, we have the kinds of ESG investments that they have, the kind of exclusions, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. Well, the level 3 are the most demanding. And we could classify according to products. So this picture, I've chosen to show this picture because right now everybody, or at least all the European managers, have this already. So it makes it much easier to understand what they are offering. I've given an example here of how we establish and define the Article 8. It's the positive tilt. And yesterday we were trying to translate this, and we said, well, I don't know how. I mean, you've got standard, first in class, and positive tilt. But look at how complicated it is. Article 8 has 3 categories. Best in class and positive tilt are 2 of them. And here it's talking about an impact, looking to have an impact, and measuring that impact. And Article 9 has that in itself and the measurement. Here we have Article 9, where we can see the stamps or labels at the bottom. One is French, one's Belgian, and one's German. There are just 3 right now. It's very complicated to get them, but there are 3. And the idea is that, well, here we're talking about the eco label. The idea is for it to be standardized and be implemented. Here we have the question that I'm trying to answer. Is it a trend? Is it a megatrend? Here we have some data. First of all, Europe is clearly a leader in terms of volume. We can see this for 2020. The light green is Europe, and the rest of the world is in dark blue. And here we can see the integration of ESG, which is blue, the second from the top, and the top one is thematic investment. What's growing the most right now is ESG and thematic investment. So this is to give you an idea. Here we can see what's going on in terms of information and measurements when it comes to communicating. Here we have the World Economic Forum. As defined for 2021, you can see that most of them are risks which are environmental and social risks. Most of them are in those areas. Here we have an example of measurement. In our firm, within an environmental strategy, we define 9 planet limits, let's say, which refers to everything that goes beyond certain limits in terms of climate change, the water footprint, CO2 footprint, biodiversity, and you can see them here. And the green bar is the strategy, and the grey one is for the global market. And this shows us that we can measure the positive effect in different dimensions. And for calculating CO2, the CO2 footprint, well, you can't imagine how much discussion goes on about that. I mean, we go down to level 4, which includes, for example, if a client comes along, and I'll give you an example, they might say, how is it possible with your strategy to have a higher CO2 footprint than this other one, which invests in the car sector or a transport company? And I say, well, what scope do you use for the CO2 footprint? The first level, they say. And I say, well, no. I mean, the transport company rents its car, so it doesn't have a footprint. We're not just looking at level 1, but rather 2, 3, and 4. So we look at direct impact, indirect impact, life cycle, and recycling of the product. So it's the entire carbon cycle. There are many methodologies, but that's how we do it. And the same thing for the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to know the effect in terms of the SDGs of the United Nations. Metrics with regards to impact. Well, here we have an example from 2020. We had a dialogue with 227 companies involved in Climate Action 100. We're talking about 550 companies or institutional investors or financial entities. 52 trillion is the volume. So we're talking with these companies to help them with this transition towards a low-carbon economy. So to finish off, I would just mention 2 ideas. First of all, what are the challenges and the realities that we're facing right now with regards ESG investment? Well, we have the market. We are far ahead of the regulations. They're trying to catch up, and we're trying to help them, but we are ahead of the regulations. Secondly, the methodology for measuring impact have not been defined, and they're not standardized, and that's the reality right now. Each of the firms or each of the managers are trying to do it as well as they can. The quality of information for environment and social is really diverse depending on the sector. It's completely different what we get in terms of information from South Korea compared to a company in Chile or in France. They're completely different. There's also a quite considerable risk of greenwashing. We've seen this, and we see it in the press quite frequently. The integration of ESG factors is a reality. Many managers already have them integrated, and in our firm, 100% of our strategies, we have 100% integration of these. And 80% cover Article 8 and are in line with Article 8 and 9 in our case. But I think that the fiduciary duty of ours and our mission and that of many other institutions and entities is to promote these changes for better in companies. So it's not about not investing in fossil fuels, but to make those fossil fuel companies speed up their transition. And what else? Well, sustainable investment generates positive changes, not just in risk management, but also in profitability. And secondly, the fiduciary duty of managers and investors is very important. We have to efficiently assign to the ones that do things in the best way and most sustainable way. And we need to improve and develop regulations. This is an important effort. We then have transparency and standardization of criteria, and this is something we don't have right now. And for last of all, if somebody wants to invest in ESG in a simple way, we think that thematic investment could be the best way to do that. I think there are 30 seconds extra.